The earth did not whisper. It roared. A roar that shattered a million years of silence. The cry of a black monster awakened. The red Texan ground trembled violently, and then, a pillar of blackness erupted toward the heavens. A fountain defying gravity itself, blanketing the world in a spray of crude life. It wasn't rain. It was a deluge of sticky, primordial, black gold. Standing in the heart of it, a lone figure was drenched. His oil-stained work clothes were soaked to a deeper black, and the liquid streaming down his face was like the anointing oil at a coronation. This was the moment the son of the parched earth was finally crowned king. This was the answer to his desperate prayer. Or, it was the beginning of the greatest trial his soul would ever face. In the late 1980s, the heat of West Texas felt like it could evaporate a man's soul. To Caleb Jackson, this land was less a blessing and more a generational curse. His great-grandfather had planted corn in this red dust, his grandfather, cotton, his father, cattle. And to each of them, the land had returned little more than withered disappointment. The poverty was a stubborn stain, passed down like a tarnished heirloom. Now it was Caleb's turn. He had decided to search for hope not on the land, but beneath it. He was an oil driller, but all he owned was a beat-up pickup truck bought with debt and a few worn geological maps inherited from his father. By day, he worked on other men's rigs, living paycheck to paycheck. By night, he poured that money into rented equipment, fighting his own private war. Every evening, as the sun bled a final, crimson wound across the horizon, Caleb's true day began. He would kneel beside his pickup truck, as he always did. His hands, rough and calloused, seemed ill-suited for prayer, but they were clasped with a desperation more pious than any priest's. His prayer was not a childish plea for riches. It was a raw cry for survival, a solemn contract laid out before the vastness of nature and God. Lord, this land is yours. Grant me the wisdom to see the blessings you have hidden beneath it. Not by my meager knowledge or my own strength, but by your power, grant me the key to unlock it. Let me find the strength to lift up my family, and my neighbors who groan under this same earth. And Lord, if you should grant me anything, protect me from the pride of ever thinking, for even a moment, that any of the glory is my own. Let me not forget this prayer, offered in the dust, even if I one day stand in the highest of places. His prayer was always specific, humble, and carried a warning for his future self. After his prayer, he would spread out the old maps. To him, they were more than lines and symbols. Caleb had a knack that others didn't. In the contours and rock strata, he saw ancient riverbeds flowing thousands of feet below. In the faint patterns of fissures, he could read the dome structures where oil lay trapped. It wasn't something he had learned in a school. It was as if the earth whispered its secrets only to him, painting a vivid, three-dimensional map in his mind. People called it luck, but Caleb believed it was God's first answer to his prayer, the beginning of the ability to produce wealth. His eyes fixed on one spot, Sector 12B. It was a forsaken patch of land, written off by the major oil companies decades ago. On paper, it was commercially barren, a dry hole. While everyone else ignored it, Caleb saw a minutely warped fault line. A tiny crack in the consensus, a sliver of possibility the big company's state-of-the-art equipment had missed. His heart began to hammer in his chest. Everyone he knew called him a fool. He scraped together his last dollars to rent the aging rig and headed for the land everyone called cursed. Failure meant bankruptcy, a life on the streets. His wife, Ellie, had eyes full of worry, but she chose to trust the wild certainty in her husband's gaze. For days and nights, the clang of metal and clouds of dust were his only companions. Soaked in sweat and oil, he gripped the levers of the old rig. The last of his fuel roared in the engine, and the great drill bit into the red earth, slowly, then fiercely. There was nothing more he could do. His wisdom, his will, his entire gamble was over. All he had left was waiting, and faith. He closed his eyes. The words of his prayer in the dust echoed in his ears. At first, it was just a tremor, a vibration he dismissed as a loose part on the rattling rig. But the tremor soon became a deep groan that shook the very ground beneath him. Caleb instinctively pressed his ear to the earth. From the deep, he heard the sound of a colossal being stirring from a million-year slumber. It was the heartbeat of the earth. Everybody back. As Caleb's shout cut through the air, an earth-shattering roar erupted. A pillar of black mud shot out of the drill pipe, and in an instant, it transformed into a geyser of blackness that clawed at the sky. It was crude oil, sticky, potent, and reeking of primal life. The first roar of Jackson Field had stained the Texas sky black. The news spread like a wildfire. Within days, the forsaken Sector 12B was a chaotic swarm of trucks and men. Lawyers and investors flew in from Houston, lining up outside Caleb's shabby trailer. Each of them, with eyes more slick than the oil itself, shoved contracts in his face. Caleb Jackson was no longer a dust-covered driller. He was a king wearing an invisible crown, and the Black River flowing beneath his feet was his kingdom. A few years later, the red dust of West Texas was a distant memory. His world was now the Houston skyline, viewed from the top floor of the city's tallest building. From his corner office, branded with the logo of Jackson Energy, he looked down on the city as if it were his own. An artisan Italian suit fit his frame perfectly. The hands once stained with grease now held a crystal glass of whiskey. His knack was now called the Golden Touch. Every oil field he touched turned to liquid gold. The markets swayed with his every decision. People whispered that he didn't just predict where oil was, it was as if oil simply appeared where he commanded it to. Gradually, Caleb himself began to believe it. He relished his own story, the myth of the poor country boy who achieved the American dream. He became a fixture in the media, his rags to riches tale an inspiration to millions. But with each retelling, the most crucial character from the first chapter of his story grew fainter. The prayer in the dust became a footnote, then was omitted entirely. Forbes asked me the secret to my success, he said with a confident smirk during a live interview on CNBC. It's simple. My guts and my instinct. Where there's risk, there's opportunity. Everyone else gave up on that land, but I saw its potential. People like to talk about luck or God's will, but the world of business is cold and hard. God helps those who help themselves, right? Well, I helped myself, more fiercely than anyone else. In that moment, he had completely forgotten the warning from his own prayer, protect me from the pride of ever thinking that any of the glory is my own. He now stood at the very pinnacle of that pride, admiring his own kingdom. His morning prayers had ceased. He was too busy, too important, too tired. His new God resided on his desk. The flickering numbers of the Nasdaq, and the price of West Texas Intermediate crude on his multiple monitors became his new Bible, his new commandments. He no longer prayed. He analyzed data and predicted the future. No, he believed he decided the future. The ability to produce wealth. The gift from God now felt like his own possession. Instead of remembering the giver of the ability, he began to worship the ability itself. And that worship drove him toward a grander, more dangerous ambition. The land beneath Texas was no longer enough. He needed a bigger stage to prove his golden touch, a place where no one had succeeded before, the deep waters of the Gulf of Mexico. It would be the final, crowning jewel of his empire. Or the watery grave that would swallow it whole. The waters of the Gulf of Mexico were calm. But beneath that serene surface lay thousands of feet of pitch-black abyss and unpredictable pressure. To Caleb, this was not an unknown danger, but a final kingdom to be conquered. The drilling project, named Prometheus Deep, would be the monument that marked the apex of his career. The board of directors protested vehemently. His chief geologists warned of uncertain data. The finance team listed the astronomical losses the company would face in the event of failure. But Caleb heard none of it. His eyes were clouded with an unshakable faith in his own golden touch. Data is the past, he boomed, silencing the boardroom with his sheer charisma and arrogance. I see the future. Has my gut ever been wrong? This was more than business. It was a ritual to prove that the power once given by God was now entirely his own. He was betting the company's fate, his entire fortune, on the darkness of the deep sea. By my own power and the strength of my own hands, I have produced this wealth. The thought thundered in his mind. He was no longer a man who prayed, but a man who commanded. But the sea did not obey his commands. For weeks, the drill bit of Prometheus Deep bored through empty water. Hundreds of millions of dollars vanished into the ocean depths each day. On Wall Street, anticipation curdled into anxiety. Caleb shouted at satellite data feeds from his Houston office day and night, but his golden touch remained silent. Then, disaster came from above. A hurricane, absent from all weather forecasts, materialized and churned toward the Gulf. With no time to evacuate, the Category 4 monster swallowed the massive drilling rig as if it were a child's toy. The multi-billion-dollar steel structure crumpled like paper and sank into the abyss. An environmental catastrophe was avoided, but for Jackson Energy, the catastrophe had just begun. The news flashed across every screen: the complete failure of Prometheus Deep and the imminent bankruptcy of Jackson Energy. The stock price became worthless at the opening bell. The hyenas of Wall Street descended. The myth of Caleb Jackson had crumbled overnight. The private jet, the ranches, the lavish mansions all seized. The people who had called him the Golden Touch turned their backs in cold silence. He stood alone in his empty office, stripped bare of everything. The glittering city skyline that once lay at his feet now seemed to mock him. In the depths of his despair, he drove home back to the red dust of his beginnings. After days spent like a ghost, he found himself drawn to his father's old, dilapidated barn. The air was thick with the smell of dust and rust. In a corner, buried under junk, was an old wooden box. Inside, he found the small, silver belt buckle he had given his father as a gift after his first gusher. The design was youthful and a bit garish, but the silver had not lost its shine. He turned it over absent-mindedly. On the back, in his father's rough but steady hand, an inscription was carved. "Remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you the ability to produce wealth." Deut. 818. The moment he read the words, Caleb's world stopped. He couldn't breathe. His heart felt like it was encased in ice. He had completely, utterly forgotten the knack that let him see oil under dry land. The daring that gave him confidence amidst the risk. The opportunity that guided his drill to the perfect spot. None of it had been his. The ability to produce wealth was a gift, freely given. It was grace. And he had used it to build a tower of pride. He collapsed to the floor and wept. Not for the lost fortune or the faded glory, but for the shame of his own arrogance. His sobs echoed in the empty barn, his tears soaking the dusty floor. These were not the tears of a Houston CEO. They were the tears of a young man, praying in the dust, who had finally remembered the first line of his prayer only after losing everything. The tears of repentance washed away the layers of pride caked on Caleb's soul. He no longer yearned for the Houston skyline. Instead, his gaze fell once more to the red earth beneath his feet. He had lost everything, but one thing remained: the ability to hear the whispers of the land. The very same gift he had once called the Golden Touch, the gift that had made him arrogant. Now, he had to ask where, and how, he should use it. Texas was in the grip of a terrible drought. Caleb's neighbors watched helplessly as their ancestral farms and ranches withered and died. The land cracked. The cattle grew thin. He, who had shaken the world to find oil, had been blind to the thirst of those closest to him. One morning, Caleb loaded his old pickup not with drilling equipment, but with his geological maps and a handful of marking flags. The first place he went was the ranch of his childhood friend, Henry. Henry's land had become little more than a desert. "Caleb, what are you doing here?" Henry greeted his fallen friend with awkwardness. "Can I take a look under your land, Henry?" Henry was bewildered, but clutching at straws, he nodded. Caleb began to survey the land with the same intensity he had once used to hunt for oil. He closed his eyes, sensing the subtle changes in vegetation, feeling the grain of the rock with his hands. His extraordinary geological knowledge was no longer being used to find black gold, but the source of all life water. After hours of searching, he planted a red flag in the ground beside a dry creek bed, under an old oak tree. "Here," he said. "It's not too deep, but there should be a steady aquifer. Probably been flowing under your great-granddaddy's feet all this time." Half believing, Henry started up his old excavator and began to dig. After a long plume of dry dust, wet mud began to fly. And then, finally, a stream of clear, cold water gushed forth. Henry scooped up the muddy water in his hands and cried like a child. Watching him, Caleb felt something warm swell in his chest, something far more powerful than what he had felt when his first gusher had erupted. It wasn't wealth or fame. It was pure joy and gratitude. Word spread fast. The fallen king of Jackson Energy was finding water. At first, they were skeptical, but one by one, his neighbors came to him. In fields where not a drop of oil could be found, Caleb unfailingly located an aquifer. When his old truck appeared in a village, people cheered as if welcoming a savior. His hands became rough again with dirt and grease, but his face held a deep peace and joy he had never known as a CEO in Houston. He no longer took money. Instead, he lived on the cornbread and fresh milk his neighbors brought him as tokens of their gratitude. He finally understood. The ability to produce wealth that God had given him was never for his own kingdom, it was a tool to tend to God's garden. It was a calling, a covenant to build community and bring life to the parched land. If the gusher of black gold had been a test of his pride, then the wells of fresh water he now dug were conduits of grace for his neighbors. One evening, he sat beside the first well he had ever dug. The red sunset reflected on the water's surface, and the gentle clang of cowbells from the drinking herd was a peaceful hymn. Caleb clasped his hands together. It was a prayer he hadn't offered in years, yet it felt as familiar as breathing. Lord, now I understand. The ability you gave me was not for my kingdom, but a tool for your garden. Thank you. Let me not forget this gratitude I feel in the dust, until the day my life ends. Caleb Jackson's name was no longer spoken on Wall Street. But in the lands and among the people of West Texas, his name became a legend. The man who lost everything at the peak of success only to find true wealth and purpose at the very bottom. People called the springs he uncovered the well of grace. And they provided life-giving water not only for the thirsty land, but for all souls who were thirsty for something more than success. Thank you for listening to my story. This is Caleb. Drunk on the sweetness of success, I completely forgot the earnest prayer I once made in the red Texas dust, the promise I made to not become proud. I'm sure you've had a moment like that, too. That first prayer or first promise you made with a pure heart when you were just starting something you were passionate about. I will use this work to make the world a better place. I will never change. I will always remember to be grateful. What was your first promise, one that you might have forgotten along the way? A. I'm still living by that promise today. B. To be honest, I lost sight of it somewhere between success and reality. Whether you're A or B, it's okay. I invite you to share your story in the comments with courage. I hope this video gives us all a moment to pause and remember our own first prayer.